September 1st, 1943. Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai's hand paused over the intelligence report, his one good eye. The other lost to American gunners a year earlier. Scanned words that made him laugh aloud in the humid operations tent. The Americans have produced a new fighter. Heavy as a bomber. Wide as a transport. They call it the Hellcat. Our intelligence suggests it weighs twice our Zero. Another American failure of design. Through the tent flaps, he could see his squadron's A6M Zeros lined up on the pierced steel planking. Sleek, nimble, deadly. For 2 years, these aircraft had dominated Pacific skies. British Hurricanes, American P-40s, Dutch Brewster Buffaloes, all had fallen before the Zero's guns. The Americans' latest attempt, this bloated Hellcat, would be no different. What Sakai did not know, what none of the Japanese naval aviators gathering for their morning briefing knew, was that within 30 days, this failure would begin the systematic destruction of Japanese naval aviation. The F-6F Hellcat would ultimately achieve a kill ratio of 19-1, destroying over 5,150 enemy aircraft while losing fewer than 300 of its own in aerial combat. It would transform carrier warfare, break the back of Japanese air power, and prove that the Zero's reign had been built on a foundation of fatal assumptions. The mathematics of aerial supremacy were about to be rewritten by an aircraft that looked wrong, flew heavy, and seemed to violate every principle the Japanese had perfected. The rising sun at its zenith. Japanese confidence in September 1943 was not arrogance, it was mathematics. Since December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service had achieved victory ratios that strained belief. At Pearl Harbor, they lost 29 aircraft while destroying 347. In the Philippines, 7 losses against over 100 destroyed. Over Darwin, 2 losses versus 30. The British Far East Fleet's air arm was annihilated. The Dutch East Indies Air Force eliminated within days. At the center of this dominance flew the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, an aircraft that had genuinely rewritten the rules of fighter design. When captured examples were tested by American engineers in 1942, they initially questioned the performance figures. A fighter with the range of a bomber, the maneuverability of a biplane, and the firepower to destroy anything it caught. It seemed impossible. The Zero achieved its remarkable performance through a deliberate and radical design philosophy. Using a classified high-strength aluminum alloy, Mitsubishi engineers created a structure some 30% lighter than comparable American designs. No armor plate protected the pilot. No self-sealing fuel tanks added weight. Every ounce was sacrificed for performance. And for several years, that sacrifice paid extraordinary dividends. The intelligence failure. The first reports of the F-6F Hellcat reached Japanese intelligence through neutral sources in early 1943. The specifications appeared almost absurd. The aircraft weighed 12,186 pounds loaded. The Zero weighed roughly 5,500. Its wings spanned 334 square feet around a bulky radial engine. It carried armor plate protecting the pilot, bulletproof glass, self-sealing tanks holding 250 gallons of fuel. Senior Japanese officers reviewed the specifications with dismissal. The assessment preserved in various post-war accounts was consistent. The Americans had learned nothing. This Hellcat represented a continuation of their failed philosophy, attempting to overcome pilot skill with weight of machinery. A Zero would fly circles around it. The mathematics seemed to support this conclusion. The Zero's wing loading of 22 pounds per square foot gave it a turning radius no American carrier fighter could match. The Hellcat's wing loading of 36.5 pounds per square foot suggested it would be helpless in the turning fights that formed the basis of all Japanese fighter tactics. What Japanese analysts failed to account for was that the Hellcat had not been designed to win turning fights. It had been designed to never need one. First contact, September 1943. The opening engagements over Marcus Island and Wake Island in September and October 1943 established a pattern that would repeat itself, with increasing lethality, for the next 2 years. Japanese pilots flying escort or interception missions encountered the Hellcat expecting to dictate the terms of combat. Instead, they found an aircraft that refused to play by the established rules. When a Zero rolled into its signature diving turn, expecting the heavy American fighter to continue straight and allow a pursuit curve. The Hellcat did not run. It went vertical. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, producing 2,000 horsepower against the Zero's Nakajima Sake engine at 1,130, drove the Hellcat upward at 3,500 feet per minute. Zero pilots attempting to follow watched their airspeed decay as gravity worked against an airframe optimized for horizontal maneuvering rather than sustained climb. At altitude, the Hellcat performed hammerhead turns that dropped it onto Japanese tails, and then opened fire with 6 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns, delivering a combined rate of roughly 4,500 rounds per minute. Japanese pilots who survived early encounters filed remarkably consistent after-action reports. The volume of fire was unlike anything they had experienced. The Hellcat absorbed hits that would have destroyed a Zero. And critically, when they dove away to escape, the Hellcat did not follow. It climbed back to altitude and reset for another pass. The weight paradox. The central irony of the Hellcat's dominance is that its advantages were inseparable from the very characteristics Japanese planners had dismissed as weaknesses. The weight Japanese officers laughed at carried 212 pounds of armor protecting the pilot, significant armor around the oil system, and self-sealing fuel tanks. A Zero that took a burst of .50 caliber fire typically exploded or caught fire. A Hellcat that took equivalent damage frequently returned to its carrier. This asymmetry in survivability compounded over hundreds of engagements into a pilot attrition crisis the Japanese could not overcome. The draggy radial engine Japanese assessors criticized produced power that gave the Hellcat decisive advantages above 20,000 feet. At altitude, the R2800 retained efficiency where the Zero's Sakai engine performance deteriorated sharply. Hellcat pilots learned to fight high, and the Zero's superiority in low-altitude turning engagements became increasingly irrelevant as American tactics evolved to deny those engagements entirely. The combat doctrine that emerged, refined from earlier work on the F-4F Wildcat, was called energy fighting. Hellcat pilots maintained speed and altitude, converting potential energy to kinetic in slashing diving attacks, then climbing back to altitude before Japanese pilots could react. The concept of refusing combat when disadvantaged, fundamental to Hellcat doctrine, was militarily sound. It was also, for pilots trained in the Bushido tradition of accepting death in battle, psychologically incomprehensible. The radar revolution. Beyond the aircraft itself, the Hellcat operated within a technological system the Japanese could not match and initially did not fully understand. Task Force 58's combat information centers used shipboard radar to detect Japanese formations from 150 miles, well before any visual contact was possible. Controllers vectored Hellcat divisions to intercept positions with altitude advantage, sun at their backs, approaching from Japanese blind spots. Pilots were guided by radio to targets they could not yet see. Japanese pilots, meanwhile, still relied primarily on eyesight and relied on individual initiative rather than coordinated tactical direction. Their radios, when fitted at all, as many were removed to save weight, carried voice quality too poor for reliable tactical coordination in combat. The result was not a fair fight between aircraft. It was a systematic, radar-directed interception process operating against pilots flying essentially blind. Japanese skill and courage, genuine and considerable, could not compensate for an information asymmetry of that magnitude. The industrial chasm. The philosophical argument the Hellcat story represents cannot be separated from the industrial context that produced it. Grumman's Bethpage, New York facility operated around the clock, 7 days a week. At peak production, a new Hellcat left the assembly line every 60 minutes. The company produced 12,275 Hellcats in 30 months, a figure that would have required years under Japanese industrial conditions. Standardized components meant any replacement part fit any airframe. Maintenance could be performed by trained technicians rather than skilled craftsmen. The entire system was designed for the industrial scale of modern warfare. In 1944, Japan produced approximately 5,100 fighters of all types. The United States produced over 35,000. The Hellcat was not merely a better aircraft. It was a better aircraft that could be produced in unlimited numbers, maintained by large and rapidly trained ground crews, and operated within a technological system. Radar, radio coordination, standardized training. that multiplied the effectiveness of every individual airframe and pilot. The pilot equation. The pre-war Imperial Navy pilot training program had been among the world's most demanding. Pilots entered combat with 500, 700 flight hours and years of intensive instruction. They were, by any honest assessment, among the finest aviators in the world in 1941. The losses sustained at Midway in June 1942 and in the grinding Solomons campaign throughout 1942 and 1943 were catastrophic and largely unrecoverable. The Imperial Navy had not built its training pipeline to replace experienced pilots at the rate they were being lost. By early 1944, Japanese naval pilots were entering combat with 300 hours of flight time. By 1945, that figure had collapsed to 40-50 hours, including pilots assigned to kamikaze missions who received little more than basic aircraft familiarization. American pilots arrived at their squadrons with 300 hours minimum, including 50 hours in type, having practiced carrier landings until they were automatic and fired thousands of practice rounds over American airfields. The technical and tactical training gap that opened between 1943 and 1945 was as decisive as any difference in aircraft performance. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, June 19, 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea represented the decisive reckoning. The Japanese Navy committed 9 carriers and 450 aircraft to Operation A-Go, the decisive engagement intended to destroy American carrier power. Against them, Task Force 58 fielded 15 carriers and 956 aircraft, including 450 Hellcats operating under the most sophisticated fighter direction system in the world. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa launched his strikes in 4 waves, confident that the Zero's range advantage and Japanese pilot skill would prevail. American radar detected the first wave, 69 aircraft, at 150 miles. Hellcats were directed to interception positions with complete tactical advantage. The engagement lasted approximately 12 minutes. Of 69 Japanese aircraft, 42 were shot down. Subsequent waves met similar results. By the end of June 19th, Japan had lost 346 carrier aircraft. American losses were 30 aircraft from all causes. The proportion of kills attributable to pilot error or accidents on the American side meant aerial combat losses were a fraction of that total. American pilots, in their ready rooms that evening, coined the phrase "turkey shoot." The description was accurate. The enemy aircraft had been as defenseless as game birds against a coordinated, radar-directed interception. Japanese naval aviation, as an offensive force capable of projecting power across the Pacific, effectively ceased to exist on that afternoon. Commander McCampbell's record, October 24, 1944. The Battle of Leyte Gulf produced the most extraordinary individual performance of the Pacific Air War. Commander David McCampbell, leading 7 Hellcats from USS Essex, intercepted a Japanese formation of approximately 60 aircraft heading for the American fleet. In a 90-minute engagement, McCampbell shot down 9 aircraft, 5 Zeros and 4 bombers, while his wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, destroyed 6 more. 7 Hellcats had routed 60 Japanese aircraft without the loss of a single American plane. McCampbell finished the war with 34 confirmed aerial victories, the United States Navy's all-time record. He received the Medal of Honor. His achievements were remarkable, and they were achieved in an aircraft specifically designed to make such outcomes possible against opponents whose training and equipment had been systematically degraded over 2 years of attrition. The Kamikaze Admission. The Kamikaze program, formally initiated in October 1944, was simultaneously an act of desperate courage and an implicit acknowledgement of the Hellcats' dominance. Vice Admiral Takejiro Anishi, who organized the Special Attack Corps, framed the calculus with brutal clarity. A conventional attack against an American fleet defended by Hellcats offered a probability of success approaching 0. A pilot flying his aircraft as a weapon had a meaningfully higher probability of inflicting damage. The pilot died in either case. At least as a kamikaze, the death served a purpose. During the Okinawa campaign of April through June 1945, Hellcats flew 38,038 combat sorties and claimed 2,351 victories. More significantly, they intercepted approximately 80% of kamikaze aircraft before they reached the fleet. Against an enemy willing to accept the certainty of death in exchange for a chance to inflict damage, the Hellcat remained the indispensable defensive shield. The final accounting. By August 1945, the results were unambiguous. The F-6F Hellcat had destroyed 5,156 enemy aircraft in aerial combat while losing 270 to enemy fighters, a ratio of 19.1 to 1. It accounted for 75% of all United States Navy aerial victories. It produced 307 naval aces. Of approximately 18,000 Japanese naval aviators who began the war, fewer than 100 combat-capable pilots remained. Saburo Sakai, who survived the war, lived until 2000 and remained one of Japan's most respected voices on Pacific air combat, offered perhaps the most honest post-war assessment. The Zero was a superior fighter. The Hellcat was a superior weapon system. We never understood the difference until it was too late. The distinction Sakai drew is the essential lesson. Japan had built extraordinary individual warriors and an aircraft of genuine brilliance. America had built a system. Standardized production, radar integration, coordinated tactics, protected pilots, and an industrial base capable of replacing every loss before it could be felt. The Hellcat entered service heavier, less maneuverable, and more expensive than the aircraft it was designed to defeat. Every extra pound represented not weakness but the weight of an industrial democracy that could afford to protect its warriors, and to replace them when protection was not enough. By the time Japanese pilots stopped laughing at the Hellcat's weight, their air forces had ceased to exist.